The collapse of trust often comes not with a thunderclap, but with a slow unraveling of silence. And at Hope Fellowship, that silence has been deafening. A church once regarded as a growing, stable congregation now finds itself under intense scrutiny, shaken not only by the revelations of misconduct, but also by the ways its leaders have chosen to handle them. In January 2025, the congregation learned that youth pastor Jerry Nickerson had been fired for past inappropriate behavior, a decision that sent ripples of concern through the community. Just 9 months later, the shock deepened when senior Pastor John McKinzie resigned after confessing what the elders described as a moral failure. For many observers, this was not just another personal downfall. It was a turning point that exposed how fragile the safeguards of accountability in modern megachurches can be. And as the scandal widened, members and critics alike began to call for more transparency, stronger discipline, and a radical rethinking of what it means to lead a church in an age of public skepticism. Like, comment, and subscribe to the channel as we break the story down in full detail, because the events at Hope Fellowship are part of a larger, troubling pattern across the American church. The firing of youth pastor Jerry Nickerson initially seemed like a decisive step by church leaders. After revelations surfaced regarding past inappropriate behavior, elders took action to remove him from his role in January. While the details of that misconduct were never fully disclosed to the congregation, the official statement suggested behavior that was deemed incompatible with the responsibilities of guiding young people. For many families in the church, this was a painful moment. Parents questioned whether their children had ever been put at risk. Leaders insisted that the issues were from Nickerson's past and not tied to his current role, but that distinction offered little comfort. The episode highlighted a recurring dilemma for churches. How much should be revealed about a leader's moral failings? And when does withholding details cross the line into protecting an institution's image rather than its people? Historically, similar cases have shown that vagueness can backfire, leaving congregations to speculate wildly and creating a culture of mistrust. The Nickerson case seems to suggest that Hope Fellowship was still grappling with how to communicate hard truths without completely destabilizing the flock. 9 months later, whatever confidence the congregation had begun to rebuild was shattered when senior Pastor John McKinzie resigned. McKinzie was not just another church employee. He was the face and voice of Hope Fellowship, its guiding presence, and a man many members had trusted for decades. His resignation letter cited a moral failure, a term the elders reinforced as permanently disqualifying him from returning to ministry. Yet no one explained what that failure entailed, how long it had persisted, or what steps had been taken to address it internally before it was brought to light. The ambiguity was glaring. In Christian culture, moral failure can cover an enormous range of misconduct, from an extramarital affair to financial dishonesty to abuse of power, and the lack of specificity left members reeling. The shock was compounded by the timing. 2 major pastoral failures within the same year suggested deeper problems within the church's leadership culture. The phrase moral failure itself became a flashpoint. On one hand, it was a shield that allowed leaders to acknowledge wrongdoing without diving into salacious details. On the other, it was so broad that it fueled rumors and suspicions, many of which were far more damaging than clear facts would have been. Congregants began to ask uncomfortable questions. Did McKinzie misuse his pastoral authority? Was his behavior criminal or merely inappropriate? Why was the church so unwilling to provide clarity? This tension underscored a broader crisis in evangelical churches, where leaders often default to euphemisms rather than candid admissions, ostensibly to protect reputations, but ultimately at the cost of trust. In many respects, Hope Fellowship was repeating a pattern seen at other megachurches, where the instinct to control the narrative only deepened cynicism among the faithful. Critics quickly honed in on one particular aspect of McKinzie's departure, the fact that he was allowed to resign rather than being formally fired. For some, this looked like a compassionate gesture, a way of letting a long-time leader leave with some dignity intact. For others, it reeked of protectionism, a decision designed to shield McKinzie from full accountability and to avoid the public scrutiny that accompanies firings. The distinction matters because it touches on the very heart of leadership integrity. In corporate settings, executives accused of serious misconduct are often terminated to send a message of zero tolerance. By contrast, allowing pastors to resign has the effect of softening the blow, implying that the offense was less severe than it may have been. It also raises practical concerns. Did McKinzie receive a severance package? Was his resignation negotiated in exchange for silence? These are not idle questions, as other churches have faced backlash for quietly offering financial settlements to disgraced leaders rather than making transparent decisions that prioritize the congregation. Speculation inevitably grew over whether McKinzie's confession was truly voluntary. While church leaders framed it as a moment of integrity, many observers wondered if he had stepped forward out of conscience or because exposure was imminent. In past scandals involving other religious leaders, confessions have often come to the 11th hour, just before journalists, whistleblowers, or former staff members reveal the truth publicly. That possibility loomed large at Hope Fellowship, where the timing of the confession and resignation seemed suspicious to some. Was McKinzie attempting to get ahead of a bigger story? Or had the elders encouraged him to resign quietly to prevent further fallout? Without transparency, the congregation was left in the dark, forced to navigate a thicket of rumors and half-answers. This secrecy drew attention to the broader culture of megachurches, where protecting the brand often outweighs telling the truth. The handling of McKinzie's resignation raised red flags. Were severance packages offered in exchange for silence? Were there non-disclosure agreements involved? Were the elders more concerned with liability than with shepherding the flock? Each of these questions pointed to the same underlying issue, whether the church's leaders were more loyal to institutional survival than to biblical principles of honesty and accountability. In an era when many religious institutions are already under fire for mishandling misconduct, Hope Fellowship's response seemed to reinforce the narrative that churches cannot be trusted to police themselves. For the congregation, the lack of transparency was perhaps the most painful wound of all. Many members had poured years of loyalty, tithes, and personal trust into the church, only to feel betrayed when leaders withheld the full truth. For families who had raised their children under McKinzie's leadership, the resignation created a profound sense of disorientation. They had looked to him for guidance on integrity, marriage, and faith, and now they were left with a void filled with suspicion. Some members expressed frustration that the elders seemed to underestimate their ability to handle difficult truths. The implicit message that the congregation could not be trusted with details added insult to injury. This dynamic has been observed in other church scandals, where secrecy breeds disillusionment, and disillusionment leads to departures. What happened to Hope Fellowship is not an isolated case, but part of a much broader trend. Across the American church landscape, vague statements and quiet resignations have become the standard response to scandal. Leaders hope to minimize damage by avoiding details, but the strategy often backfires, creating more questions than answers. The reliance on terms like moral failure reflects a culture more concerned with optics than with truth-telling. High-profile cases like those of Bill Hybels at Willow Creek or Ravi Zacharias at RZM demonstrated how damaging this culture of concealment can be. When the truth eventually comes out, and it almost always does, it devastates congregations far more than an honest, transparent disclosure would have. In this sense, Hope Fellowship has become another cautionary tale, reminding us that secrecy may provide short-term protection, but leads to long-term erosion of trust. The calls for stronger accountability systems have grown louder in the wake of McKinzie's resignation. Observers argue that churches must adopt clearer policies, independent oversight, and third-party investigations when misconduct arises. Without these safeguards, churches will continue to mishandle crises, often in ways that re-traumatize victims and alienate members. Transparency, accountability, and humility are not just optional virtues, but essential requirements for spiritual leadership. The scandal of Hope Fellowship has underscored that point with painful clarity. By allowing McKinzie to resign quietly, by keeping details vague, and by shielding leadership decisions from public scrutiny, the elders miss an opportunity to model the very values they preach. In the end, the story of Hope Fellowship is about more than one pastor's failure. It is about the structures that enable failure to flourish unchecked. It is about the gap between what churches proclaim, truth, light, accountability, and what they practice when their own leaders fall. And it is about the people left in the pews, whose faith in God may endure, but whose trust in their church leadership has been profoundly shaken. The lesson is stark. When churches protect their leaders instead of their people, everyone loses. The path forward will require radical honesty, independent oversight, and a willingness to place the welfare of the congregation above the preservation of reputations. Until then, scandals like the one at Hope Fellowship will continue to erode confidence in religious institutions. The unraveling of Hope Fellowship has become a sobering reminder that leadership without accountability is a recipe for collapse. Congregations deserve transparency when leaders fail. Pastors who misuse their position should not be shielded by euphemisms or quiet resignations. Institutions that claim to represent the truth must embody it, even when it is costly. And while forgiveness is central to Christian faith, forgiveness does not negate the need for accountability. Hope Fellowship's story is now part of a larger reckoning within the church, one that will either usher in a new era of honesty or continue a cycle of secrecy and disillusionment. To keep unpacking stories like this and ensure the truth is never buried, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe.